right. Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the Summer 2020 PERCoGS Professional Skills Panel about research methods. We have three wonderful panelists here with us today. We have, I'm going in the order that I see people on my screen, Ben Van Dusen, Daryl McPadden, and Katamari Rosa. And I guess I'll let each of you, if you could introduce yourself, who you are and where you're at, and tell us a little bit about the methods that you use or have used in your research. That would be really helpful. So Ben, would you be willing to go ahead and start?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Ben Van Dusen. I am switching between positions. So I'm just taking a new position in this fall at Iowa State in the School of Education. The methods I've used, in my graduate work, I was a mixed methodologist. But since then, have started working with larger quantitative data sets, and that got me thinking about, like, well, how should we go about analyzing, large-scale data sets, which led me down the path of thinking about issues of equity and kind of bringing those things together. And so how can we deal with quantitative data in ways that don't perpetuate inequitable oppressive systems and ways that help us dismantle them? And so often quantitative work has both knowingly and unknowingly supported those systems. And so that led me down the path of learning about a framework called QuantCrit, or using quantitative methods with a critical framing. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking about how we can do work with especially large scale numbers, but quantitative data in ways that promote equity. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. Daryl, would you be willing to go next?
Sure. So I'm Daryl McPadden. I'm an assistant professor at Michigan State University. In terms of methods that I've been using, in grad school, I was pretty heavily in like the quantitative methods world. I did a lot of like non-parametric statistics, so looking at data sets that didn't have a normal distribution. I've also done some work in network analysis stuff. And so kind of played a lot with like the data set quantitative realm. As I transitioned into like my postdoc and current job, I've done a lot more qualitative work. I think the questions that I'm interested in tend to be a lot more qualitative. And so I've been kind of working in that space of like, how do you pick up new methods when so much of your training is not in qualitative spaces. And so I've been doing a lot more like case studies and interviews more recently. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that in the next hour.
Katamari, would you introduce yourself next?
Sure. Thank you. So I'm Katamari, and I'm a professor of physics in the Institute of Physics of the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. And I have been working mostly with qualitative methods. And what I usually do is I like to listen to people and to tell stories. So I like to tell people stories. And I usually do that with people that traditionally don't have their stories heard, not necessarily told, but heard. And so I mostly use interviews, and I have started using oral history interview, using an oral history approach, which is a little bit different from what I used to do with interviewing. So I found out that there are different ways also of interviewing. And that's something I had to learn, not that I had to learn, but it's something that I learned because, as Dara said, with the questions I was trying to answer, and then I found other methods. So even within qualitative methods, I'm still like learning new methods.
All right, so we have a couple of questions for you all, and I'll kind of share a slide with the questions on them and introduce it to you. And then I think feel free to chime in if you have an immediate answer, and we can kind of alternate who takes the first pass at that, and then the other two panelists can kind of add anything in that you want to add, if that makes sense.
Sounds good.
Cool. There we go. So our first question was about how do you learn new methods? How did you learn new methods in grad school or during a postdoc or as a faculty member? And part of what we're interested in knowing is kind of how long it takes or how you get comfortable with a new method. Like there's some sort of process between just kind of reading about it and actually implementing it. So what's your process there?
Okay, I can start.
Great.
So I actually learned about interviewing in grad school, and I had classes on interviewing. So I had like a full semester just discussing interviewing. I had classes of qualitative methods and quantitative methods like separately, but I had a class focusing only on interviewing. So that was something that was really good, and that's how I learned the theory, right? And then you have to do the work. There is no other way, I think, unless you do it, you have to do it, and then you start to get better, I guess. I hope I'm better now. And it's practice, it's training, it's feeling what feels comfortable to you, because I think people also, I don't think there's like a method that is, oh, this is much better than the other, but it depends on the questions you have, it depends on the resources you have as well, and on your personality and things like that. For example, I am a very quiet person, and so for me, it's very easy to listen, and like it's easy to pay attention to details when I'm listening to people. So that for me is something that I felt very comfortable. And now that I'm doing oral history, I was like, okay, how do I do that? I learned that it was not the same thing as just interviewing, and I didn't know how to do it. So I looked for people who knew how to do it. So I went to talk with this professor, which I have as a mentor. Although we don't have this mentoring culture here in Brazil, but it's what you would like call a mentor. And I talked to him, and he suggested some literature. I started reading, and then after that I thought, okay, what are places that do that well? So I went to the American Institute of Physics, and they have the Center for History of Physics, and they do lots of oral history. So I said, okay, I want to learn how to do that. And then I started going to their conferences and talking to people because I wanted to know more about the methods, and that's how I started doing it. So even though I am a professor at the university, doesn't mean that I know like all methods, and I had to ask for help, and I reached out for like senior people or more experienced people.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think I follow a similar process. Like I definitely will talk to people as like a first step, and like ask the experts that I know in my area for other resources. I think just personally, the things that I've found really helpful are like having a broad overview. So like it helps me to know, like in qualitative methods, these are the different types, and then I can focus on the one when I know where it fits with the other kinds of methods. And then I usually try and find like a paper that will focus heavily on the method itself and like the nitty-gritty parts of that method. And then I will also try and find like 2 or 3 really good examples of that method being used. That I find that combination of like knowing the method itself and then the examples is really helpful for me when I'm learning new methods.
Yeah, I have a similar thing where kind of seeing someone do a thing, probably like, the first time I'm like, oh, that seems really cool. I should be doing that, I think. And then a lot of times it's hunting down articles and looking for good methods articles usually means going outside the field of PER. I mean, there are some good methods articles in PER, but a lot of them, right, education researchers, data scientists, and there's these people who there are methodologists in other fields who have a lot of experience that I know I need to draw from. And so finding those pieces, and a lot of times it means I just finished, I just submitted an article and I'm reading more things. I'm oh, maybe I should have done that differently. I'm okay. So then I read more. I'm I totally should have done that differently. And so a lot of times what I will then force myself to do is let me reanalyze that data using this new perspective or this new, method. And okay, I see these differences. And sometimes it also means forcing myself to actually write a methods piece on it. Or I need to understand this. And the best way to do it is I reanalyze my data so I understand it. And then push myself okay, I want to understand this well enough that I could write an article on it. And so that's something that I've been doing kind of an iterative cycle. I do some new piece of research, then write a methods piece on the new thing that I did in it, and then do a new piece of research, and then an accompanying methods piece. Oh, I did something new here, and yeah. So that's forcing myself to do that. But there's so many good resources out there that that are outside our field. Another thing is there's some great online courses. Some of them are just asynchronous. You can go on and do these trainings at any time. It happens that next week I'm actually signed up for 2 different online courses, one in hierarchical multiple imputation and one on Bayesian modeling, and learning a lot of these through AERA, American Education Research Association. And some of them are free, some are very inexpensive. So taking the time to do a day workshop or a couple day workshop, you can learn a lot. Yeah. Oh, and finding people. I know other people brought up finding good people to work with who know it, especially the first time I do it. I'm let me go at my university, find somebody. For me, it's find a statistician or find someone who I'm friends with and be hey, can you help me? And we can co-author a piece together. And then usually I'm okay on my own for the next one, but that's been really useful.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah.
So our next question is pretty similar, so maybe you won't have a lot more comments about this, but kind of how do you develop expertise with new methods, and what really takes you from just kind of reading about it to being ready to use it in a study that you publish?
That seems like a really big question. I think one of the things that I find, especially with methods, is paying attention to what kind of assumptions are built in. That when I understand the assumptions that a method is employing, then that makes me feel a lot more ready to apply it, that I know when I can apply it and when I shouldn't apply it. I think there's also a certain amount of you read until you think you're ready, and then you try it out, and then you figure out if you were ready or what parts you weren't ready for, and then you read some more, and then you go back and you try it again. Yeah, that's kind of my general philosophy.
I think that iterative nature is important. It's not doing entirely new things all the time. It's it's little bits. Like I said, then looking back and being well, should have done that differently, and I'll iterate on it, and then so I'm sure whatever I'm doing now, I'll do the same thing next year, but it's not about getting it right. It's about doing what you can with what you know, and right when you know more, you'll when you know better, you'll do better. But it's be forgiving of yourself and learn along the way.
There was one thing that I was just remembering right now, is that I know this is more into analysis, but they are sort of together. So the analysis part and the methods I choose. And for me, it was really helpful to have a group of people who were experts in, maybe, well, in different levels of expertise of the same theory I was using in my work. And they all read some of my interviews and parts of my interviews and the analysis I was making of that data. So that for me was really helpful to see things that I wasn't seeing. You know, there were things I didn't see, and I was like, oh yeah, that's right. So it's nice to have other eyes on your data, and because all of these are together, the philosophy, the framework where this method come from, and how you're going to analyze it. So those three things are intertwined. So having this group of people to help you out, for me, it was really good. And the way we did it, we had, so let's say we were 10 people, and then we would read some data of someone and ask, well, first I would say like, oh, that's what I want to know or to learn or the help with. And then they would do with my work. And then we all would do with someone else's work and like that. So all 10 people were having their work analyzed in a way as well. So it was good. And, you know, you don't feel like, oh, it's another work I have to do, because people are also helping you. So that was very helpful for me.
I think that to piggyback on that just a little bit, so I like that we're definitely having people who of different levels. So it's like talking to people who know this really well is useful, but also trying to explain it to somebody who knows nothing about it, and forcing yourself to be like, okay, how do I teach somebody this thing? You know, or how do I talk about it? That can also be really useful, which could be like your parents or, you know, your friends or other people in the field. It's like different levels of expertise, and sometimes you're getting more feedback from them, and sometimes it's practicing yourself. All that can be really useful.
Before we move to the next question, I saw that Brian raised his hand. Brian, did you want to ask a question or add?
Yes. So on this topic, before we move on to the next, you were mentioning how in order to develop expertise, you like this method of iteration, right, and trying out the methods in practice. Now, I know that sometimes when I try to implement new methods, specifically ones that are personally impactful, like through interviews regarding sensitive discussions, there can be trauma that gets brought up, or even in our interpretations, there could be harm that is caused and perpetuated because we're trying these new methods and we don't necessarily have the expertise to avoid those. So how do you do this iterative research, right, to gain that expertise while trying to mitigate the harm that could be done by somebody as a novice using these methods?
That's like
Really
a great question.
Yeah.
I can start and say that for me, well, first of all, have someone that is more experienced and go through, in my case, interviews, go through the questions. And the IRB is, they're going to look and they're going to force you to think about what are you going to do in a situation if that happens, or if so. It's like several scenarios you need to think through when you submit your IRB. At least that's how it was for me, or how it has been. So I have to sort of try to think of several scenarios and think how I'm going to address them. That doesn't guarantee I'm going to be able to do that. But at least you thought that through. And again, I think only experience and time will help you to get better, but I don't think there is any guarantee that you are not going to do, to cause harm or to do something wrong. And we learn from that, and we also try to have, in case of interviews, a very honest and open relationship with the person you are interviewing, and letting them know exactly what you're doing and where you're coming from, and just let people know. It wasn't, in my case, I worked, and I've been working mostly with Black scientists. So first it was like women scientists, now I'm women physicists, now I've been interviewing Black scientists of several fields. And there is the saying, I'm a Black woman in science. So there is this also rapport, right, that you build with people, and I don't know how you learn that. I don't know how that's learned. That's I guess.
You brought up a good point, Katamari, about positionality. Matters too. Like the answer for one person might be different for another person, given their relationship to the interviewees or the data, and which is not an answer.
I think there's also like, you can never prepare like for that moment, like when you're in an interview, but we've always encouraged like doing a pilot interview with someone who may be similar to the people that you're interested in interviewing, which like doesn't give you exact, but can bring up like similar situations, and you get a chance to like try out words or try out questions in an environment that is like less threatening, and in a space where you can ask the person that you're interviewing, like, I'm concerned about these things, could you tell me ways to improve? And kind of open up that space for feedback before you go into like your interviews, especially if there's only like 3 people to interview and you're worried about like messing up one of those. So you can get some of that like iterative process. It's not perfect, but it's definitely helpful.
Thanks. All right, so I'm going to move on to our next question, which is, I think this is maybe related to a lot of the things we just discussed, but have you ever been in a situation where you realize partway through your analysis or through your study that your methods or the framing aren't doing what you need them to do? If you have, how did you kind of adjust course?
So I can say when I designed my dissertation study, I thought I was going to be using like normal distributions and very happy and like normal statistics, like p-tests, everything, it was going to be fine. And then I realized that part of how I designed my survey made like a floor with like a large tail on my distribution, and that my distributions were not normal whatsoever. And I had to adjust my like analysis and the way that I was analyzing my data because my data wasn't fitting that distribution. And so that was, I guess, one of those things, I guess, going back to what I was saying about assumptions, where knowing what assumptions are built into your methods can help you tell when it's fitting and when it's not. And that sent me kind of down this rabbit hole of what kind of statistics exist for non-normal data, which then involved kind of what we were saying before, reading more papers on what do these methods do, how do I actually use them, and figuring out how that applied to my data.
Oh, I switched the question, which I didn't mean to do. Does anyone have anything to build on what Daryl said?
I have examples of where this has come up for me. So definitely, I've been to the point where I've submitted a paper, gotten generally pretty positive feedback, some minor changes, and then kind of realizing like there's more I need to do here. They're not asking for it, but I know to be true to this data, to be true to my questions, like I got to do some more stuff. And so I've actually gone out and like solicited external reviewers, reworked a bunch of stuff, and come back and said, okay, here's my response to like the reviewers, and here's the other reviewers I went and got for my paper and the feedback they gave me and my responses to them, you know, and it's don't be in a rush. Like I know sometimes you'll be like, oh, I really want to get that publication done, you know, but sometimes it's worth the time to do it right. And you know, I've had this in a number of publications. Like basically, I have a done thing. I'm like, oh, I've changed from using SPSS to R. It's like we're going to redo all the analysis because it's like one little thing I wanted to add, and we had, you know, like okay, you know, but now I know how to do that, and hopefully it's a better product. So I mean, don't be afraid to do some like going back to the drawing board, as difficult as that can be sometimes.
And there might be some amount of just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? Like I could have ran all of my statistical tests assuming they were normal and just ignored it, but that doesn't mean that's what you should do. And so taking the time, like what Ben is saying, to figure out what you should do, which takes some digging, but it's usually worth that to be able to justify why you're doing what you're doing. I think Katamari was going to say something too.
There's one thing I learned in this awesome class of interviewing, and that was really helpful. So it's to build this matrix of questions and everything you need to answer for your dissertation, for example, or your thesis, if that's the case. But everything you need or you want to answer, and you need to have questions that are going to able to give you an answer for each of them. And you shouldn't have questions that they're not connected at all with things that you are interested in. Because if you just start like writing questions, you may leave things that you need to know. You may leave that out, and you may ask things that you're not going to use. So it was a simple thing. It was this like a matrix on like my spreadsheet, and then had all the questions and like sub questions and everything, and then the questions from the actual interview protocol on the top. And then I was, okay, this question can answer this, this, and this. This is going to answer just that, but it's okay. And then I could also see like which questions were being, okay, I had the possibility of gathering enough data or a lot of data, and others that had just few questions that would help to answer that. So I thought, okay, I need to improve this part and to have more questions that are going to help me with this. So it was really good because it was like easy to see what you had more and what you had less. So that was something that I use until today.
We are interested to know kind of what new methodologies you like to learn or see becoming more prevalent in PER, and kind of how you see a critical approach to the methodologies that we're using in the field evolving as the field matures.
Okay, so again, if no one talks, then I'm quiet, but I talk a lot as well, so it's a weird combination. I definitely have things I would like the field, not only of PER, but academia in general, to start to adopt. I don't know if adopt is going to be the word, but I would love to see PER, well, first, using more qualitative data in analysis and methods, because we are still very, very quantitative. Unlike general education research, we are very quantitative. But more than that, I would like to see other frameworks being used. And particularly, I would like to see frameworks that come from non-traditional academic views. So from original people. Is that is that a correct translation? I'm thinking in Portuguese how we say it, but I don't
First
think it
peoples?
sounds. I think that sounds strange in English. It doesn't seem that that's what it is. Because I think you only use indigenous people, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think traditional knowledge, maybe.
Okay, so traditional knowledge to be used in academia and not as something that esoteric or something that we really value and learn from this traditional knowledge. So I really would like to see that coming into our methods. It's like a shift of way of thinking.
Yeah, I think in terms of like how I'd like to see the field maybe mature is to be more explicit about justifying methods. Like I think right now I see a lot of like, I did a case study because I just have one person. Like, cool, but why is that a good case? Why are you choosing a case study instead of interviewing more people? Like, why are you doing that? Or on like the quantitative side, like, sure, you're picking a threshold of 0.05 for your p-value. Why? Why does that matter? Like, really digging deeper into what we're doing and why we're doing it and justifying those choices, because they're choices. They're not like set in stone ways that you have to do them. And so I think that would help in terms of like the field maturity. And there's a lot of resources that I think we could pull in from other fields to help us do that better.
This question gets to the heart of a lot of what I've been thinking about these last several years. And so if I had to pick one new methodology, I'm going to piggyback on what Daryl said, and this may sound like heresy to many, but I would propose that I would love to be able to convince the field to stop using p-values, which is the recommendation of the American Statistics Association. It does much more harm than good. So there are ways to do that. So I think there are a lot of things, a lot of ways we as a field can improve in all areas. And I've been thinking specifically quantitatively. And the big question I have is how do we move the field forward and critique the methods that we use as a field without having individuals feel critiqued, without saying, oh, you did this thing, you must be an idiot. And one way I'm trying to do it is point out, like, look, I have published doing that thing, but so have these other ones. And we need to think about, okay, what limitations does that mean? Like, what caveats do we need to think about with these studies, some of which are, whether it's a foundational study, whether it's, Hake's study, and think about, right, normalized gain versus use and measure like Cohen's D, or, how do we think about moving forward without people feeling attacked, but still being honest about how strong, our findings are, and, and trying to move forward with our methods. But I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Since you brought it up, Ben, could you say a little bit more about what the limitations you see for p-values and what other alternatives there might be?
Yeah, so p-values are not well understood. And so a lot of times people will say, oh, okay, so I got this p equals 0.05. That means I have a statistic. I have a significant finding, and it means there's less than a 5% chance this was random. And in fact, kind of neither of those statements are true. It means you have a statistically significant finding, which might not mean anything. It tells you nothing about the value of that finding. And a p-value of 0.05 means that there is a 5% chance that this would occur randomly. It does not mean that there is only a 5% chance that your findings aren't real. Like the inverse, those are not inverses of each other. So people misinterpret it, and oftentimes they'll talk about very meaningful differences between two groups and say, oh, well, these are insignificant, because the p-value is small. And really, it's not that the differences are insignificant. They, in fact, might have like a very large effect size, but they lack statistical power. They don't have a large enough sample for that to get this small p-value. And so they'll kind of say, oh, well, no difference there. Moving on, we'll call that zero. And that is never what the p-value was designed to do. That's not what statisticians would recommend you do. P-values help you think about the uncertainty in the model, and there are more nuanced ways to discuss model uncertainty. The trick is everyone is taught there's a really easy test. You get a p-value, and it's like, oh, if it's 0.05 or less, I put a star there. Everyone believes it, and we're good. But it's like it's taking what could be used as like this rich thing to think about and flattening it and kind of mass producing it, and that's what everyone knows to do. But it's never how it was designed to be used. And we could, as a field, we could learn to use it better. But I'm taking up the American Statistical Society's Association's guidance and say it is so broken and so ingrained in a broken way, we need to abandon it and go to different methods. Things such as confidence intervals, which gets at the same idea, but helps you think about, like, just because this thing might cross zero, it could also be really high, and that's equally likely. It's just a little more holistic approach to thinking about data. And this comes up in equity stuff so much, where it's like, oh, you've got, only 10 women in your physics course, and you want to look at the difference between women and men. And so your sample is so small, of course, your p-value is large. And so he's like, oh, no difference there. This is equitable. It's like, that's not what your data says. In fact, you probably don't even have data to really answer that question. But we lead to these really erroneous conclusions. And it's really frustrating. I think it does damage to our society and our field, and especially around issues of equity. I'll get off my soapbox now.
I support you in your soapbox.
The paper will be written on this, just a matter of finding time to write it.
So our next question was kind of about something that a lot of you have touched on already, which is about kind of pulling in methods from other fields. Particularly, I think a lot of us are like drawing on methods from science education in various ways. And I think sometimes PER kind of adapts those for our specific questions or specific standards. So we're just kind of wondering if you could speak to how you have adapted methods from science ed or, other disciplines maybe beyond that. And how do you respond to critiques maybe that you're not using them appropriately, or make sure you are using them appropriately on the other hand?
I would say that, like, hands down, the best courses that I took in grad school were in the education department on like intro to qualitative methods and like advanced qualitative methods, which provided me with that like base foundation of this is what phenomenology is, this is what phenomenography is, this is like the difference between these like keywords that you hear, and enough resources to know where to go deeper into each of those things if I needed to, and also provided me with like the community to talk about those things. So like I had a whole class with structured readings with a professor, with classmates, where we would have discussions about these methods and what is different about this one, what's different about that one. And so like I think having like a detailed course specifically on methods is actually really helpful. Even if you don't end up using that particular method in your study, even just having like the background and the community to talk about methods with was super helpful for me.
I think, so many of our fields are really siloed, and so what's going on, whether it's in, education or ethnography, different ethnographic research, or, PER, all so separated. I mean, I kind of feel like my career to date, I haven't done anything new. All I've done is like help move information from one silo to another. And it's like, it's novel, like nothing I'm doing is new. It might be new in this context, and like, that's great. And there's like, turns out there's a lot of value to being, a boundary spanner that can move knowledge around between these communities. And yeah, that's where I kind of see my large part of my role, my goal in the community is just like to help move knowledge that somebody else came up with and move it here and help contextualize it in this new context. So there is something novel there. But yeah, sometimes I'm like, I'm not doing anything new. It's just, it's a new place for it to happen.
Well, I think kind of building off of that, like with this like purist critique of using methods, right? Like, I think that's something that I remind myself of is like, I'm not the first person to conduct interviews. Like, there are people, so many people who have written books on this, and like, I should read those books before I think that I'm the expert in interviewing, right? Like, always remind yourself that like it's worth going into the deep internet dig to find who else has already done this, even if it's not in your field or your immediate field.
I would first say that there's nothing pure about this critique. So the purist critique, it's for me very impure. And I actually just look here on the dictionary, like, what's the contrary of pure? Because I didn't know. And that says impure, adulterated. So that, I think, what this critique is. And I agree with Daryl looking at the literature. So for my dissertation, I used counter storytelling. And then I had to, so one of the chapters is a story that starts like once upon a time, something like that. So I tell a story with dialogues, and that's not academic. And then I was like, okay, so let me see who did that. And then I got all the reference and I said why I was doing that. And then I had to justify a lot, which was good in a way, because then I was very confident that I wasn't doing something that was completely like nonsense. There were bases for that, and then I got more knowledgeable about those bases because I had to justify a lot of my choices, because not from my advisor actually, but she was concerned with. She's like, the field is not going to take that. We're not going to accept that because no one does that, and that doesn't look, like academic. And so we had to read a lot and like go to the literature to justify everything.
So like I said, there's always going to be haters. There's a classic example of a person who I won't name, but a senior figure in our field who, the question, people will be doing this cool, like awesome new stuff, and they'd be, yeah, where's the physics? Like, I don't see the physics. Like, it wasn't attached to like learning this equation. Like, it didn't matter. It's like, okay, and that's where we used to be. But like, so that might be like a purist critique. What you're doing PER? Where's the physics? It's like, well, but we can go beyond that, right? To look at, whether it's looking at the social interactions of people who do physics, like so valuable. And to maybe a purist, that might, one type of purist that wouldn't be acceptable. But like, hopefully we can be accepting of a lot of different kinds of research, and we can bring in new things, even if it's kind of scary to folks to whom it's new. New stuff is always scary.
Brian, did you have something to add?
Yes, so I am very for interdisciplinary approaches, and I try to justify my interdisciplinary uses through critical race theory, as one of the tenets is using interdisciplinary approaches. But that is my use of a concept that came from legal studies that was used in education, and now I'm using it in PER. So it's I'm using an interdisciplinary justification to justify interdisciplinary approaches. Is there any, or are you aware of any internal to physics PER resources or documents, or any way that we can justify interdisciplinary approaches from within our field?
I don't have a great resource. To me, it's like heartbreaking that we would feel like somebody would feel like they would have to justify it. Like it just seems obviously like immediately apparent that we should do these things. And I like, especially people doing their PhD work, stuff. It's like, all right, you have people to answer to. And like, I hate to think that somebody would be getting dragged to the coals and having to justify that. My heart goes out to you or anyone else who is running into that wall, feeling like, hey, I got to come up with a great citation that says I should be able to do this. Like, oh man, that's awful.
Yeah, I mean, I go back usually to the I think it's Adrian Traxler and Jennifer Blue's paper on beyond binary gender, and they call for interdisciplinary approaches, I believe. But that's what I tend to go to, and that's what I do, since my focus of research is close to gender. So that's the resource that I use. But I don't know how somebody else would approach it from a different context. But yeah, I mean, it's we shouldn't have to justify these interdisciplinary approaches like that.
I think there's also like, I don't know, this is maybe completely unrelated, but you could also justify it by saying like, this is how science is done. Science is interdisciplinary, and as a part of science, we as PER need to be interdisciplinary. And like from the science side, there's plenty of like, you could even just do like NGSS says like one of the core principles is interdisciplinary knowledge. And use that as like a justification of this is how science is done, this is what we are doing.
What about the Deber report could help some. The National Academy's Deber report, they talk about wanting to share across the STEM disciplines, which is, they don't get as much into like, outside of the sciences, but at least this idea that we need to be informing each other. That might be one thing you could say that holds a lot of weight, Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thanks. That's kind of the last prepared question we had for you. And I guess before we wrap it up, I wanted to ask if there was anything else that our panelists would like to add, or any questions that this raised for you.
I just would like to tell people to not be afraid of trying something new. And even if you make mistakes, you most probably will make mistakes. It's okay. It's that's why we are here. We are learning all the time. And if you are, let's say, attracted to this method that you're, oh, I think I would like to do that, but then you are afraid because you don't know how to do it, or you don't have experience with that, just try. And especially if you are a graduate student or even an undergrad student, that's the time to try. It's the time to try everything. And then if you do something really bad, that's a problem of your advisor, because they are supposed to help you out, not do something like completely terrible. So the risk is low. So try. You're going to have support. And if you don't have support, like close support, go try to find support in another group or with other people. But just don't. But try, because grad school is already so hard that if you're doing something that you're not passionate enough about, it's going to be so much harder. Even if you love something, you're already, I don't think I can make it. So if you're doing without this love and doing something that you are really interested into doing, it's harder. So I would just say that goes to something that, just try something if you are interested in trying something new.
Don't be afraid to reach out to people too. And people might be busy, but if you saw somebody do something cool, like it's okay to cold email someone, or especially if you have an advisor, like go to your advisor and be like, hey, do you know someone who does this? Do we have usually, a lot of people are happy to help, usually if somebody's like, hey, you did this cool thing in your paper and I want to learn more. I'm like, I am totally flattered that somebody read my paper, and like I'd be happy to help. So I mean, not everyone will be as receptive, but hopefully you can find someone.
I think the other thing that like I don't know that we've talked a whole lot about at this point is like how your methods tie to your research questions. Like to me, the research questions are like your guiding light. If you should have a research question, you should always revisit your research question, and that should dictate what methods you're using, because the methods will tell you how you're able to answer that question or if you're able to answer that question. And if you don't have a question, then it's easy to like flounder on your methods or just pick something without being able to justify why. So like I always start and lead projects through the question. What is the question that you're trying to answer? And that ties to methods and it ties to analysis and like the other different parts, but start with the question, then figure out your methods.
Well, thank you all for being here today and for answering our questions. I'm gonna stop my screen share. There we go. And yeah, we're just grateful that you were able to chime in and answer these questions for us. So,
Of course, thanks for hosting this.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, and thanks for inviting me.
thanks for being here.